I have to live with that forever.
How many people yearn to take one of Dr. Hawkins' courses? Yes, yes, yes.
They're like, we don't want to go back to school. Stop it.
No, it's not school. That's not school.
No.
Questions and answers, please. Questions from here, answers from here.
How do we keep embodied solidarity from becoming appropriation of suffering?
Sure. Yeah, so I put this up here because I'm writing a book about this. Oh, I'm sorry. She said, thank you for the reminder, Daoud. She asked, how do we keep embodied solidarity from being appropriation of other people's suffering? And so I tried to allude to that in the talk in a subtle way, but back to what I was saying, I have a book that I'm writing about this, and I think this is going to be the paradigm, the 4 Ps. I already talked about our perception a lot. Our positionality means putting ourselves in places of suffering. So what it means to do that already, generally speaking, since we avoid these places, right? So, I often use the model of Jesus. And the model of Jesus, you may or may not know, there's a story of the Good Samaritan. Do most of you know the story of the Good Samaritan? Or you've heard about the Good Samaritan? We use this as a phrase now, right? Be a Good Samaritan. There are Good Samaritan laws in cities, right? You have to help someone who's hurt. Or, on the other hand, you can weasel your way out because if you do CPR wrong, you could be sued, right? Seriously, that's a law in some places. So the idea is purposely going through places or going to places where oppression abounds. And the way the Good Samaritan epitomizes this is that Samaria was a place of half-breeds. So when people were traveling, they walked around Samaria in order not to be tainted by the unclean half-breeds. So the fact that Jesus and his disciples are walking through Samaria. The Good Samaritan is a parable, but Jesus also meets the woman at the well in Samaria. So, and the woman at the well, he knows who she is. She's had several husbands. Some people think she's a prostitute. Some people say, why would you assume that? Because she's a woman. She's had several husbands, that's what we know. And he tells her who she is. And he dares to talk to her, and he dares to drink water from her. So he combats gender oppression, combats racial and ethnic oppression, religious oppression, sexuality, right? And so he does all this in one fell swoop only because he put himself in the middle of a place where the oppressed abounded. And really all he did was ask questions. He walked with her. He talked with her. He knew her. We think Jesus, in the Christian tradition, we think Jesus was God, but human, right? So he had these special powers. We don't know how they worked. But he knew people. He saw people. He was human. He was earthy and ethereal. He spit in dirt. He did all these things to show, I am a human just like you. And so positioning ourselves in these hard places means hard conversations where we actually don't have the upper hand. He did, but he didn't use his privilege or his position because the idea was to become, he was harassed and helpless as well, right? Suffering servant, Jesus is called. Our posture, Jesus' posture was always to meet people where they were. So it's hard to come into places of oppression where we're not the oppressed, where we don't know much about it. Or I had a great conversation with someone who's here yesterday about, I am of a particular ethnicity, but I don't look like it. How do I walk in solidarity when people see me as the majority other, right? And so we're all in these positions where we just have to humble ourselves. To say, again, empty hands, I don't know how to do this. I'm just here. I think that takes away some of the appropriation of the suffering too. There's this thing called false, martyrdom. We don't choose to be martyrs. Martyrs are made, right? So this is not, again, I kept saying, this is not poverty porn. This is not an oppression tour. This is not social justice-y crusading. You're not coming into spaces of oppression where oppression adheres in groups and around bodies and systems and structures. You're coming without answers, and so you're coming in the most prostrate way possible, humbled to the dust. So that takes away some of that bent, right? So it's a lot about our attitude, it's about our posture, and then it's about our perspective. Again, what coming into spaces of embodied solidarity ultimately does would be to change our perspective to learn from the perspective of the oppressed. So why in my faith does Jesus say, become like the little ones? You have to become vulnerable. Why does Jesus continually say, blessed are the poor? Not just the poor in spirit. So Matthew says the poor in spirit, but Luke says the material poor. It's probably both, right? So this idea of becoming poor is the same as humility, but what Jesus is also saying is there's something about the perspective of the poor, e.g. the vulnerable, e.g. the suffering, right, that we don't get in our privilege, in our positions of privilege, right? So I'm a woman of privilege. I've got a PhD. But in my intersectionality, my black body, my female body, in a very Christian context, my single body, right? I also embody these various oppressions. And what I value more than anything is perspectives of those who are oppressed, because that's where I see what is life really about. So instead, in our country, this is what we do. And I'll end here with the answer to this question, because I know this is long-winded, but we make fun of things like the values of the South Side of Chicago, where people celebrate. So President Obama has done this. So like I said, I'm equal opportunity. Look up President Obama's Father's Day speech, June 2008. He makes fun of the fact that families and communities, especially poor communities, mostly black and brown, have 8th grade graduation parties. Because it's a community, these are communities where education is prized. And so Obama says, stop spending money on those parties and put it in a college savings account. These are also communities where children have calculated their life expectation to be 19, because on the south side of Chicago, where I used to live a stone's throw from Woodlawn, and my church was in Woodlawn, which has 25% extreme poverty, not just poverty, extreme poverty. Kids do the calculus, and they know they're not going to live past 20. So of course, when they get money, they don't put it in the bank, they go buy candy and Cheetos. That's what you would do too. They're not all in gangs, but they've done the math. And so the fact of the matter is, in our positions of privilege, we can't see what's the logic in having an 8th grade graduation party. He also said most black fathers are bad fathers. Just listen to the speech. But actually, CDC comes out with a study 3 years ago that said black fathers are more hands-on, black single dads, than those of you sitting around here with pedigrees and Oxfords on. That's not an accusation, that's statistics, right? So we can't know what we don't know. That's not an accusation. We can't know what we don't know. We can't understand the dynamics of communities and problems without hearing and learning the perspective of the oppressed and what it actually looks like to celebrate humanity. Because I can tell you, the kids that I used to teach from the most underserved, I would do this in the summers when I was at Wheaton College, they would come and I would teach them this class called Race and the Politics of Welfare. And can I tell you what they said the American dream was about? Having a happy family. A happy family. That's deep. Not cars. I mean, one of them wanted a nice car. But you know what kid doesn't? But they're the only, and I would do the same exercise in my class. What's the American dream? What are the tenets? And these poor black and brown, undocumented kids from all over the Chicago metro area were the only ones who thought that the American dream was about being more human, not making more damn money. And that's what we have to learn from the perspective of the oppressed. And yes, I get very agitated and excited about it, because that's how I learn. That's how I know what I don't know. That's how I learn how my own value system and theologies and philosophies are effed up, where there are holes in them and inconsistencies, by listening to the perspectives of the oppressed. And that's my life's call. Other questions? Yes?
So we're in the South here, and I just went to Chicago Theological School, so we know the holes real well. I can see them. So speak to some of us that are on the front lines here in the Christian evangelical world, where, like even to be here today would be considered probably inappropriate. And I've been told this by a couple of friends, so I speak for some of us that are here today. So how would do we have these painful, is that where it starts, these painful conversations one-on-one with our brothers and sisters, that they are threatened
Yeah.
when there's a future faith together?
Yep.
Because we're not ministering to suddenly now, we are part of the other.
Yeah.
So speak to that.
Okay. So her question was how she identified herself as part of a broader kind of maybe evangelical movement. She already told me earlier she's part of some activist groups. They're having a dinner tomorrow night that I can't go to, an Arab feast, I think you called it, and I'm guessing they invite people in. The issue, this is a complicated question. And what I don't want you to hear right now is me pointing the finger at the college I used to work at, talking about broader currents in evangelicalism, which I see as a socio-political movement, and I see evangelicals as what all Christians are supposed to be, because one of the last things that Jesus says is go and make disciples, share your faith. Almost every major religion has some facet of that, right? Sometimes that's more with word or with deed or with proselytizing or hitting people over the head with a Bible. I don't recommend that. But the idea is Christians are called, all of us, to be evangelical. So scholars, we study these groups historically, and we know historically fundamentalists are those who withdrew from society. So they're Christian fundamentalists, right? So the Scopes trial, the 1920s, creationism versus evolution, social Darwinism, the rise of that leads to Christians to withdraw from society and politics. And then what happens is in the 1940s, many Christians said, actually, we need to be, as the Apostle Paul says, in the world, but not of the world. And one way we can't retreat to be in the world. We don't retreat from the world. We become involved in politics, art, culture in the same ways that other people do who are not Christian, perhaps, right? And so essentially this is the rise of what we now term evangelicals. They have this emphasis on, interpreting scripture in a way that is not quite literal like fundamentalists, but interpreting scripture in these ways that tend to be, say, the Bible is the inerrant word of God. It's true, right? We share our faith. That's what evangelicalism means. Also, church attendance is very important. And so a couple of other things, reform of society. And so you could even look at the great progressive era of American history, the kind of the anti-saloon leagues, the Women's Christian Temperance Union as early evangelicals. So all of this to say, evangelicals are peculiar creatures in that they talk about their relationship with Jesus in a very individualistic way, which is very contrary to the way that when I grew up in a black church, African Americans tend to be fairly evangelical in terms of spreading the good news, right? Sharing their faith. But what they are not in the same way that evangelicals are is like they don't approach politics in the same way. It doesn't have to be one note. And in addition, in my upbringing in a black church, I actually kind of lost my train of thought here because I kind of started teaching a class on religion and politics and history. It's a former occupational hazard. But whatever the case, evangelicals then start entering and assuming society. One of the things then that happens is they start taking more political dominance. In the black church, sacred and secular have never been separate. So churches do politics. Sacred and secular, that's a West African axiom that carried over into black religion in the United States. So Jesus is political, or Jesus isn't Jesus, or Christianity is not Christianity. That's how the black church looks different than the evangelical church, even though there's some similar notes. This is, I think, where I was going. So fast forward back to evangelicals contemporarily. What's happened is this loss of power of the kind of Reagan bloc that was formed. Jimmy Carter considers himself an evangelical. He was the first evangelical president that only lasted one term. Great post-president, bad president. And then what's happened now is evangelicals are losing market share as millennials diverge and vote for a libertarian candidate. Oh my gosh. And then what happens is this loss of market share leads to a retrenchment and a desire to recoil these values, right, to get back market share. So the fear is then that evangelicals will become like mainline Protestants, the Presbyterians or the Methodists, who believe in the social gospel, which is like helping people. I'm just telling you. And that's the difference. There's this fear of loss of purity of the faith. It's the mainline Protestants and the Catholics who are on the front lines of the civil rights movement with black people. It was not evangelicals. Billy Graham integrated his crusades. Granny loves Billy Graham. Let's get this straight. I'm like, Granny, Billy didn't say nothing. So that's what evangelicals did. They weren't on the front lines of that social movement. And so the way that the politics then plays out is there's been this retrenchment of, we can't lose the purity of this kind of evangelical thing, but the purity of the faith has become wedded to Republican politics. And this is the term that Christian scholars call the Christian right. They're generally talking about evangelicals. There are Catholics on the Christian right. There are other religions whose orthodoxy or conservatism leads them to the political right. But this is a unique bloc. So evangelicalism has crept into what you're talking about, and some of the purity is, a lot of these interfaith people, they used to call it ecumenism. That's a bad word. Interfaith is bad. So I've started calling it multi-faith, people of many faiths. I'm pretty sure that won't appease your friends. But it's a way for me of trying to say we can remain distinct in our belief. We don't have to abandon or jettison the tenets of our faith. And the individualistic nature, this is where I was going, of evangelicalism in the United States means there's less of an emphasis on communalism, and that's contrary to embodied solidarity. So I think that those are some of the things that you could maybe try to point out the irony that there's such a thing as collective sin. Like I said in a session earlier, it's not just the South that's to blame for racism. I mean, we need to all claim that. It's the whole country, right? So how to take collective responsibility, collective blame, have a collective consciousness. We need to get out of that idea in evangelicalism that Jesus is my homeboy. He's my personal trainer. Prosperity gospel. I mean, that's the extent. I'm saying it in a funny way, but I'm serious. I think that's actually detrimental to the faith, to the Jesus that I saw in the gospel, was building a social, I think political movement, but not in the way of politics that in Christian parlance, we say it wasn't the king of the Jews that they were looking for. It wasn't that kind of kingdom, right? It wasn't that political kingdom. It was another kind of kingdom, a heavenly kingdom. So we use that political language as a way of saying, yeah, it's a movement, but it's not individualistic. So that's another way of approaching the difference. Like what you gain is that perspective from other Christians who are like us, who read the Bible too and pray on their knees and stuff. You had a question.
Yeah, I wonder if in this context.
Last question.
Okay. Last question.
How do you see somebody like Dr. Jonathan Haidt, family of Abraham co-sponsored Timothy School, and as the author of the book, I like the name of the book even.
The Righteous Mind?
The Righteous Mind, why
Yeah.
good people are divided by religion and politics.
Mhm.
But if our assembly here has to do with a community, and a community by definition has diversity, and the diversity wants to get together, then how do you see his identifying a way to overarch the diversity is to see that each group, from right to left, conservative to liberal, has its moral roots. We may have one set, the other group may have another, and therefore it's respect. You have a different set of moral roots. So how do you see that kind of thinking? I thought it was really great, but do you see that as a community?
Yeah. I think what I lament is when we emphasize tribalisms, I think that's really unhelpful. It's really unhelpful. Because I think that what I hear sometimes is a negation of particularity in that tribalism is inherently bad. I mean, I think war is inherently bad. That's my actual bent. But I do think that there are reasons to maintain our particularity, but it's back to what I was saying earlier. I don't think we respect other people's morals. And this is, getting back to the question previously too. We don't expect the morals of other groups unless we respect their human dignity first. The reason that you can't come to a conference that says it's interfaith, or the reason I don't think it's going to matter that I call it multi-faith, is because we don't really respect the other religionist. We don't really respect the human who's different than us. Therefore, I can talk all day long about how Maryam is praised in the Quran, or the surah that the Imam mentioned earlier, how much that sounds like Genesis 1, how much that actually accrues to what Christians, evangelicals, mainlines, Catholics profess as bedrock. But I will also say part of the individualism of evangelicalism, which is the largest group of religionists in this country, that individualism actually means that we have taken a focus off of Genesis 1. The image of God. There can be no Jesus without the image of God. There can be no Abrahamic religions without humans being created in the image of God. Hinduism says namaste. I say image of God. Who cares? The secular humanist manifesto talks about human dignity as the bedrock principle. You don't have to be a person of faith to get that human dignity. The Cyrus cylinder, Babylon, human dignity. We're not the first people to behold this principle. Let's not pat ourselves on the back because we accept other tribes. Because we actually don't accept humans created in the image of the divine. And until we do that, I tend to like Haidt's argument, but until we do that, our politics are defunct. And we are going to hell in a handbasket. I'm just a realist. But I happen to be a Christian, so I have hope because, Jesus always makes me hopeful. And millennials sitting in the back row make me hopeful. So that's the last question, but I'm happy to chat, give you my email address. Follow me, Twitter. I have a new a new website, and I'd like feedback. And so shameless self-promotion, LaryciaHawkins.com. There's no free goodies there, just would love to get to know you and keep in touch, and there's contact information there as well. So thank you.